Well, thanks, Jay, for having me. It's a privilege to do this podcast with you, to know you as a friend, but also just to speak to the realities of the criminal justice burnout with law enforcement, with correctional officers, and the care and the ministry that's so important, as well as the ministry for inmates. But um, my first vocation out of college was a sheriff deputy in Sacramento, and I worked at a jail. And so, being a Christian man and being employed uh, in that type of environment, I remember going through the sheriff academy, and I was told 99% of the officers have experienced divorce. Uh,
Mm,
Amongst the criminal justice environment, you have an incredibly high rate of suicide. And when I was in the jail working, I absolutely felt like I had a ministry to the officers, to the sheriff deputies that I was working alongside, as well as to the inmates. And the officers recognized, I think, right away the value that I brought in because of my ministry role. For example, when an inmate in particular was breaking down, having a stressful time, maybe showing some fits of rage, and just was being problematic, it was often that they'd say, "Hey, go get Shock." Shock will come talk with them, and oftentimes officers would pull me aside and just people would break down and cry about a broken home
mm,
life, about the stress, about the PTSD. And so I knew that God was calling me to shepherd in that environment. And so, my heart today, as I work with Good News Jail and Prison Ministry, is to minister to the incarcerated, but also to minister to the staff and to the officers that are working in that environment. And one of the things that I do, I have the privilege at the York County Prison to speak to our graduating recruit classes. And so a couple times a year, they bring in officer trainees, and then they're going to become correctional officers. And at those graduation ceremonies, I introduce myself and I talk about the chaplaincy and what we do. But I really encourage them to take a holistic approach to their well being, meaning
mm,
that, I tell them that they need to have a very active and vibrant spiritual approach, and regardless of what their faith background is. But the people that survive long term in these kinds of fields are those that are taking care of themselves physically, that have an active social life, that have an active spiritual life. And taking that holistic approach is what's going to provide longevity. And so, yeah, I love the ministry that I have. I've been, as you mentioned, a pastor in a church. I continue to do that. I'm a discipleship pastor part time, but working full time as a prison chaplain.
that's fantastic, Darren. I tip my hat to you because I know anyone who works in public service, it's not an easy job, especially the chaplaincy. And many listeners may not be familiar with the differences between a full-time vocational pastor in a church versus a prison chaplain. And I know you've already briefly mentioned a little bit about your role generally, but do you mind just maybe pinpointing a little more detail about what does exactly a chaplain do from day to day?
Yeah.
Now, many inmates, they're locked away behind bars. They're away from their families. Their children are suffering at home. Many have mental health issues. Do you feel like the services that you provide helps reduce some of the recidivism that we see in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, what's interesting. I had a conversation with a group of men, and I was explaining what I do, and I'm going to get into that in a second.
Mhm.
But I
Take
said,
your time.
yeah, essentially the role of a chaplain, in fact, one of the taglines of Good News Jail and Prison Ministry, which is the organization I work through, our mission is to put pastors behind bars. And so that's what
Mm,
I am. We take pastors and ministers from the community, and we put them behind bars for the purpose of meeting the spiritual needs of both inmates, officers, and staff. But what I do on a daily basis is I meet people where they're at.
Mm.
You know, Jesus tells us, you know, to not forget those who are in prison, to visit them. And in fact, he says, when you visit the inmates, you're visiting me, you're ministering to me. And so on a day-to-day basis, I have an office space. I receive a couple of hundred requests a week from inmates that want everything from prayer, counseling, Bibles, books, diet accommodations for their faith,
Mm.
etc. In fact, I've ministered to so many different types of faiths. I've been introduced to faiths that I've never heard of before. I've had you know, Rastafarians and Odinists and Wiccans and you know, Muslims, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. I've had Satan worshipers perform satanic altar rituals in my office because they have a religious right to do that, and somebody has to give them the opportunity to facilitate their religious beliefs. I've had Jews light menorah candles in my office. I've had Wiccans do seances in my office.
Wow.
I've
Seances in your office.
in my office. It's crazy. I've had Odinists cast runes in my office and all sorts of things that I'm like, what is this stuff? What exactly is happening here?
Good
But the
night.
neat thing is that in all of those spiritual experiences that they're having, I'm not there to participate with them. I'm there to give them the opportunity to facilitate their own experiences. But the great thing is, I have the opportunity to follow up with them. So, in order,
Mm.
as an example, you know, I have a Satan worshiper who's has this altar that he's put together in my office through some supplies that I've given him that, you know, of course, have to meet safety and security standards first. But then after he does his ritual, his routine, I get the opportunity just to speak with him and say, you know, can I ask you some questions? Tell me what is it that you think you're accomplishing here? What kind of communicational relationship do you have with who you're praying to and who you're worshiping? How do you know that they're hearing you? How do you know that they're responding to you? Tell me about the relationship that you're experiencing.
So
And
you're
then,
saying this is actually a way to further share your Christian faith. So if you have a Satan worshiper in your office, obviously you're opposed to some of the practices, but you use that as an opportunity to still spread the love and message of Christ.
exactly, because somebody is going to give them that opportunity. They've got rights in the United States to practice their religious services. So if I'm not in there, somebody else is going to be in there. The difference between an evangelical Christian like myself and just say a county employee that's hired to sit at the chaplain's desk is, you know, a county employee is going to meet those accommodation requests. In other words, when a Muslim says, can I have a Quran? They're going to say, sure, here's your Quran. Or if a Satan worshiper says, I need to do this seance or this altar, they're going to say, sure, come on in and do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to be providing a type of shepherding and a type of pastoring that a county employee isn't going to do. Whereas I'll be able to ask questions and follow up, and I'll invite them to allow me to share what I think. And 100% of the time, I can tell you when I ask an inmate, hey, do you mind if I share what I believe about such and such? They say, absolutely. You know why? Because they have a chance to sit on a couch in my office
Mm-hmm.
and talk to me about themselves. People love to talk about themselves. People, you know, I've had guys come into my office and they sit on my couch and they say, man, I haven't sat on a couch in 10 years. And they'll sit and talk with me about whatever's on their heart and mind. So I take the opportunities of meeting them where they're at, hear their story, ask them about their faith beliefs, and then say, hey, do you mind if I share what I believe about that? And then
Sure.
now you've got a conversation going. And once they give me permission to share, which they always do, then I can speak about how does their belief differ from what we read in the Bible. And then, I mean, I can tell you when I've given a Satan worshiper his first Bible and seen the look of joy on his face when he's made a decision for Jesus Christ, That's the kind of thing that excites me. That's the kind of thing
Definitely.
that gets me up in the morning.
Man, you just blew me away with all that. I have never looked at that perspective before because in my past, I was a cop, right? I was actually patrolling the streets, but never really living among the inmates and seeing how they practice their traditions, their religion, and customs. So, what you're saying, I'm pretty sure, is quite significant to my crew. So, Darren, you served both jobs as a sheriff's deputy and also a prison chaplain. And I'm pretty sure that there are a few differences, perhaps. So, I bet you've probably seen a lot of trauma, right, from both sides of the fence. What would you say are the few common challenges among inmates locked away, whether it be the jail or the prison system? What's
Yeah.
really the underlining issue going on that society really does not understand?
Well, the most common three factors amongst the incarcerated population are these, and they're in this order. Number one is fatherlessness.
Mhm.
Number two is failure to graduate from high school. And number three is having a child out of wedlock. Those are the three most common factors that we see amongst the incarcerated population. And it doesn't mean that if you have any of those three things, you're going to wind up as an inmate.
Right.
But of the inmates, those are the most common factors. And so, number one being fatherlessness, that plays such an enormous role on the life of a young man in particular, to not be raised by another man, to not be shown how to live by
Mm,
another man. I don't say that to diminish the role of the mothers in the home.
right.
Um,
Definitely.
but let me give you a scenario that kind of paints the picture of the gravity of fatherlessness. Another chaplain who's in our organization, he worked at a facility that had about 500 male inmates. And our facility is significantly larger, but his facility had about 500 male inmates, and there was a local church that had called up the warden, the administration, and said, "Hey, Mother's Day's coming up. We would love to be able to provide some Mother's Day cards to your inmates as a ministry. Would you please let us know how many cards we can provide?"
Mm,
Well, the administration thought that was a great idea, and I don't know, they polled their population or something, and they said out of the 500 inmates, they have requests for about 750 Mother's Day cards. Because a lot of these men are raised by their aunts, their grandmothers, their moms, the women in their lives that have raised them. Well, the church was blown away by that number, but they graciously provided the 750 Mother's Day cards. And as you know, Father's Day rolls around the next month or so. The church reached out and said, "Likewise, we'd like to provide Father's Day cards. Please let us know how many we can give to you." Well, they had 11 requests for Father's Day cards out of that same population. And
11 requests.
11 requests, 750 Mother's Day cards, 11 requests for Father's Day cards.
You do the math on that one. That's pretty low, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. And so you see this commonality. The greatest factor is fatherlessness. And so you have to look at why that is. I like to listen to Thomas Sowell, and he's got such a, he's one of these guys. There's a lot of great ministries out there, a lot of great foundations out there that do fact checking and research. And Thomas Sowell is not a minister. He doesn't have a faith based ministry, but he does a lot of social and economic research and fact checking. And he was citing some very interesting things, talking about the fatherlessness rate. He says in 1940, about 87% of the Black households in our country were in poverty. And
Mm,
by, and by 1960, that poverty rate had dropped by 47%.
wow.
And he talks about how the parentless rate, the out of wedlock rate, we see these correlations. He says, uh,
And by the way, not to cut you
yeah,
off, I just want to sort of piggyback on what you're saying. Dr. Soul is a phenomenal, brilliant man, and I respect his literature. So the very fact that you're mentioning one of my heroes, I'm getting all excited right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, he says that there's a report called the Moynihan Report. It came out in 1965, and it studied in particular the Black family unit and the Black family poverty rate in the United States. It was written and conducted by a man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who he was the Assistant Secretary of Labor at that time under President Johnson. And he said the out of wedlock birth rate amongst the Black Americans in 1965 was 25%, but today it's over 75%. That number has increased by over 50 percentage points.
My goodness.
And Thomas Sowell cites that it's the welfare state that the Johnson administration had instituted, which has led to this enormous fatherlessness rate. And so when the welfare state incentivizes women and says that we will give you a check as long as there's no man in the house, you're paying people to not get married. And, this is an enormous problem because I get asked a lot of times, looking at the prison population, the fatherlessness problem is enormous. The percentage of, in particular, Black inmates as opposed to white inmates is so disproportionately high. And when you look at why that is, you can't help but say government interference, which has led to the incentivization of the breakdown of the family unit. The government and the world is trying to destroy the family unit at such an alarming rate.
That's right.
That's what needs to be addressed, and that's what needs to be dealt with. The kind of programs that we're offering, and when I say we're offering, when I mean rehabilitation programs and the type of services that the county provides for inmates are not addressing the real heart of the issue.
So it sounds like that you're saying there's definitely a family dynamic problem that are leading some of these men and even women locked up behind bars within the African American community. And I noticed something that you did not say was you're not blaming the police. It's not necessarily a police officer's problem that people end up locked away. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the narrative in society today is that, defund the police, get rid of the police. It's the police's fault that, in particular today, the narrative is that the Black community is suffering at the hands of the police. One of the major fallacies with that, you look at, I think it was the United States Census rate that says that there's more women in the United States by virtue of population rate than there are males. So there's more ladies in the United States than there are males, but yet the population rate of the incarcerated is 10 times higher for men than it is for women. The reason why I cite this is I was having a discussion with a correctional officer who was saying, the Black incarceration rate is disproportionately high. And he said, I think to your point, he was trying to argue the fact that cops were going after Black Americans. And I said to him, I said, it's disproportionately high. I said, would you argue that there should be more women incarcerated in the United States because there are more women in the United States than men? And he said, well, no. He said, because men are committing more crimes than women. And I said, well, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the African American community makes up about 13% of the U.S. population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. But according to the Federal Bureau of Investigation crime statistics, violent crimes are 48% committed by Black American men. So you've got basically 50% of violent crimes being committed by what is less than 6% of the U.S. population. Well, why is it that less than 6% of the US population is committing half of the violent crimes in the country? And you have to look at the fatherlessness rate amongst that 6%. And I think there's a direct correlation there. And it's too easy to blame systematic things, which I think are a fallacy.
And that's one of the things that bothers me so much today. Everything is about systematic racism, right? I mean, there's no statistical data that can actually prove that. But I love the fact that you're not making general blanket statements. You're actually sticking to what the research and the data says. I can respect that. And I appreciate what you're saying about the African American community. Me being a Black American myself, I'm not a perfect dad, but I definitely try to be involved in any way that I can with my kid's life, because everyone, I don't want to see them locked away behind bars. I want them to do the best they possibly can. So being that mentor in your life is extremely important.
It is, and the Black married family unit is doing better than both the white and the Black married family. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. The Black married family unit is statistically doing better than both Black and whites as a whole. And what I mean is this: since 1994, the poverty rate amongst married Black families has always been under 10%. But the poverty rate amongst the Black community as a whole has been higher than 22%, and the poverty rate amongst the white community as a whole has been higher than 11%. But where you've got the Black family unit being in a married monogamous relationship, the poverty rate is somewhere between 5 to 7%, showing that the married family unit is doing better in the Black community than in the rest of the country as a whole, with the exception of the Asian community, where monogamous family units are something like 96 percentile. But I guess that what I'm trying to say is that lifestyle choices matter, marriage matters, two-parent households matter, and
Absolutely.
you see a direct correlation. And it's because God's plan is what's best. God's plan is what is ideal. And where society breaks down God's ways, children out of wedlock, fatherlessness, and we're seeing the prison population comprised of people that are absolutely satisfying those statistics. So it's a moral issue. It's a family issue. It's getting back to the roots of God's design. And your original question is, how does the prison ministry see a reduction in recidivism? We believe that God is in the business of changing lives. We believe that every person is redeemable, regardless of what their sin background, regardless of their criminal background. And so our ministry is to go in and talk to inmates and officers. And I have inmates. You could throw a dart at the list of the inmates in our population, and they're going to be a repeat offender. Everybody that's in there has been in there 5, 10, 20, 30 times. And when I talk to guys in my office every single day, it's the same conversation. They'll tell me, Chappie, I know what I need to do when I get out of here. I know what I'm going to do. I've got this plan in place. I can do it. And I'll say, you're avoiding a relationship with Jesus Christ because you believe that you have it within yourself. It's this Oprah Winfrey philosophy, Oprah Winfrey philosophy that says you can do it. You just need to be the best person you can be. You have it within yourself to do X, Y, Z. And I say, you're going to go back to the same environment. You're the same person going back to the same environment, and you're not going to experience the change to where you can have victory over sin apart from Christ. You cannot have victory over sin apart from Christ. And it's getting them to believe that. And once they have accepted that reality, that they are inadequate, that their ways are inadequate, that's when you see recidivism drop. That's when you see guys who have been in the system for 30 years and in jail 20 to 30 times never come back again. or slow down the amount of times that they come back, because with the help of Christ, they are beating addictions, they are beating habits, and they are able to set up boundaries that change, that insulate them from the bad environments that they're going to return to. So,
Man, Darren, you are dropping some serious knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, we are listening to Chaplain Darren Shock. He is absolutely laying some key principles out there, and I hope you are listening to this. So now, Darren, your ministry mission statement, I had an opportunity to look at that. And I'm going to read this because I think it's very important for the listeners to know. Quote, the most effective tool for ministering to the needs of inmates and staff is the daily presence of a chaplain. The chaplain serves as pastor, counselor, mentor, and a friend to incarcerated people, which I think you were mentioning a little earlier. And your whole purpose is to guard and to protect them in a different way spiritually. So many of my listeners may be a little perplexed or maybe have a different opinion than you do. So I want you to shed light on this point. How can you possibly, right, mentor violent offenders? Now, think about the victims and their families. How can you mentor these people who have caused so much hurt and pain to the people they inflicted the most damage on? How do you reconcile that as a spiritual chaplain?
well, that's a great question. In the 7 years that I've been a chaplain, I've never once looked at an inmate's charges. I have
Mm,
access to every single one of their records. I can pull it up on my computer in a moment's time, and I've never looked at an inmate's charges. I've never asked an inmate for his charges.
mm,
And the reason is because, well, there's several reasons. One, I don't want to get into that game or that sinful habit where I think to myself or say to myself, his sins are worse than my sins.
wow.
I'll
That's
sometimes,
deep. That's deep, man.
yeah, I will sometimes take a Bible down to what we call the pedophile pod. If you're familiar with, with this, I'm sure, just having worked in law enforcement, is that pedophiles are seen as the worst of the worst amongst criminals.
Yep.
Murderers hate pedophiles, and
Hmm.
so they are kept in an isolated unit. And I've brought down Bibles to them and counseled and ministered to them. And I remember some of the officers saying to me, not even God can help those guys.
Wow.
And I said, you know what? If I ever get to that mentality where I think, your sins are greater than my sins, then I need to step out of the ministry until the Lord corrects my thinking. Because yes, different sins have different earthly consequences. I get that. But how do I minister to the worst of the worst? Is because I'm a sinner too, and I needed Jesus, and He saved me from
Mm,
my sins. And so, uh, society has put a stigma on criminals. They're out of sight. They're out of mind. We don't want to see or hear from them. And we need to have ministers. Jesus has to remind us to go and minister to those in jail. We have to be told
yeah.
to do it because our humanity says, I don't want nothing to do with them. So I think first and foremost, you have to just say, Lord, if it wasn't for you, I'm dead to my sins.
Mhm.
First thing. But secondly, I don't have a different message if a guy's a baby raper, if the guy's drunk in public, if a
Mm,
guy's high on methamphetamines. I don't have
mm,
a different gospel message depending on their charges or on their crime. I'm there trying to share the love of Christ with them because somebody took the time to share the love of Christ with me. And if it wasn't for the Lord pursuing me, I wouldn't have pursued him. So I'm a vessel, I'm the hands and feet of a community that says we want an evangelical chaplain in our local jail. The community is paying for me to be there. The community, I'm a
mm.
volunteer at the prison. People in the community, local churches, local businessmen and women, they supply my monthly budget so that I can go and volunteer
Sure.
to do what I do. And so that says a lot about the York County community, that they value an evangelical chaplaincy. And it has literally been 40 years. We celebrated 40 years just this 2 months ago, that the York County community has been consistently paying for volunteers like myself to go in. Good News Jail and Prison Ministry celebrated their 40th anniversary.
Well, shout out to York County for doing that. That's a long time.
In a lot of communities, they don't see the value of that. They wouldn't reach into their own pockets to put Christians behind bars to be chaplains. But shout out to York County for doing that.
Absolutely. That's how I know you're the real deal, right? Because when we think about pedophiles and those who have committed sex crimes against children, it's like, no way, they're not redeemable. And we wish the worst type of punishment on offenders like that. But the very fact that you are still able to look through that and stay focused on preaching the gospel to them, it reminds me directly of what Jesus Christ would do. I know for my listeners, that's a hard pill to swallow because I'm still wrestling with that within myself. I want to transition a bit. So, what is the most devastating thing you have seen while serving as a sheriff's deputy and also a prison chaplain? Maybe is there a specific story that comes to mind? Many of my listeners have no clue what prison life is really like. Is there an incident that truly has changed your life?
Well, I've certainly got a lot of stories to tell that are, they're fascinating. They're fascinating to me, but they usually are to the audience that I'm talking to too. But, I would say I learned over the last couple of years that correctional officers who make a career out of corrections have a lifespan of 15 months after they retire. So
15 months.
this is documented federally. We had a federal program come to the York County Prison that has been tracking and documenting correctional officers in their health and well-being. And the lifespan of a correctional officer is 15 months after retirement.
My goodness.
And it talks about the PTSD that's experienced because, when I'm working in the jail, not only as a sheriff deputy, you get those call outs, and all of a sudden at the drop of a hat, keys are jangling, people are running through the halls, and you're responding to a backup situation. And just knowing that you're on high alert all the time, your brain is physiologically releasing chemicals, that fight or flight chemical. And over the course of a lifetime as a correctional officer, if you work in corrections, 15, 20, 25 years, your brain is literally, I'll just say, cooked to an extent with this constant chemical production, which is causing that fight or flight. And most correctional officers have no resources or tools on how to correct that. And by the time you get out, your brain, in a sense, has aged so much and has frazzled so much that you literally just have a year and a half to live. And so
Is that why I have so much gray hair right now? Even though I'm bald, it's coming in.
In first responders and law enforcement, in all of these things. So there's learning some facts that have really changed the way I view this profession. A lot of times people just look at, they say, hey, you don't need a college education to go do corrections or maybe to get into law enforcement. And I think too many people downplay the value and the severity, the intensity of what it means to be the first responders of a community, and the toll that it takes. And so I've learned to appreciate very much what our law enforcement and corrections staff do. But as far as maybe just a story, there's been so many inmates that I've seen and talked to that you just say, um, how does a person get to this place in their life? I can't even begin to relate to a lot of these guys, and on many levels, I don't relate to them. What I mean is, sometimes I'll have somebody come up to me in a church. I preach at churches and talk about the prison ministry, and they'll say, "Hey, I spent some time in prison. I think I could make
Hmm.
a good volunteer, a good chaplain because I can relate. I had a colorful past with drugs and crime, and I say, well, maybe that's true. You might be a great volunteer or great chaplain, but I don't have that past. I don't. I've never tried drugs. I've never been drunk. I've never been arrested. I don't come from divorce. I've never, the things that you typically see with the incarcerated. I don't relate to, but
Hmm.
it's not about how well I can relate to their crime, or their past. It's about where are the common needs. And so sometimes when I'm talking to a person whose life has become so just depraved, they're in there for such heinous and gross and gasping types of crimes that I just say, Lord,
Right.
only you can transform a life. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
no, what you're saying makes sense. And I love the fact that you're not pretending to be someone that you're not. You're just you. Like you said, you never experimented with any of these things or been locked up, but somehow you don't let that deter you. You don't have to so-called keep it real, right? You're yourself. You're representing the cloth of ministry. So I think any person with common sense could appreciate that. But I want to transition. We hear about the stories, especially from our listeners who may only know about prison from the TV shows like Lockup,
mm,
right? I'm a big fan of the show. I like to watch it a lot. We see the prison violence, maybe prison rapes, the assaults against correctional officers and staff members. Is it really like that behind bars, or is that maybe a misconception?
yeah, people ask me, have you ever been afraid? Have you ever been attacked? Are you
Yeah.
in fear for your life? And um, personally, I have not. I don't feel fearful when I'm in the jail. Now, I will say this: there is a difference between where I work. I work at what's called the York County Prison, although it's really a jail. It's not a prison. A jail is a county facility where inmates go typically while they're awaiting sentence. They're still going through the court process, the litigation process. And then once they get sentenced, they usually head upstate to a prison facility. And so a prison is typically a state facility that houses post incarceration inmates, and a county jail is usually a pre sentence facility. And they might sometimes house inmates that are just serving a short sentence of like a year, year and a half.
Thanks for
But
clarifying that.
yeah, and so where you get the real gang problems, where you get the stuff that you see on TV, tends to be in these state facilities where
Mm.
guys they've already been sentenced. They're in there for 20 to 30 to 100 years. Um, at that point, they have quote unquote nothing to lose. They join gangs. They're going to be there for many, many years. So they want to establish their presence, a name for themselves. They have to pick a side. And that's where the more violent tendencies, the stabbings, the gang fights tend to happen.
Right.
Yeah, we do have gangs, and yeah, we have to keep people separated even at the local jail level.
Hmm.
But typically, guys are waiting to go to court. They're trying to, in some respects, be on better behavior because they are still going to face the judge. So, but I will say this: the stuff you see on TV is obviously dramatized. I get calls every day from family members that say, "Hey, my son was thrown into the hole. I'm scared for his safety." And
Mm.
we do have, the hole at the York County Prison. It's just isolation. It's not like you see in the movies. You're not stripped naked, hosed down, thrown into a 4 foot by 4 foot dark, lightless room and fed a loaf of
That's the
bread.
perception. I mean, let's keep it
Yeah,
real, right? Sometimes when we think about prison life, you're tossed in the hole somewhere in isolation, you're butt
yeah,
naked, and you're being starved to death. But that's far from the
yeah.
truth.
Right. I mean, to be honest, even in the hole, guys, have can watch cable TV. They have opportunities to use tablets. They're getting three well balanced meals a day. They get commissary, et cetera, et cetera. So it is not like it is on TV, but violence does happen. There are people that get shanked, even in the local jail, and there are gangs, etc. But no, I'm not in fear for my life. But part of it too is I'm kind of a good guy in there. I mean, the inmates, I'm a resource to the inmates. I'm there to help them. I'm there to
Mhm.
advocate for their spiritual well-being. So you don't make too many enemies as a chaplain, because you're a pastor to them. So.
Darren, thanks for explaining that to my listening crew. I also want to know something. Many of us have kids and children, right? That seem to have a serious problem of not obeying the law. So when we discuss youth offenders and getting locked up, what types of crimes have you seen youth offenders get in trouble for?
Well, we do have youth in the York County Prison. There are youth that are being charged as adults, and so they are in our facility. They're not in a youth detention facility. But your question's probably broader, just in general, what are youth? Again, I think one of the things that I find fascinating, um, citing Thomas Sowell again, he talked about how in 1948, teenagers were expected to work. And I'm just citing one of his case studies. He says in 1948, the unemployment rate amongst teenage males was about 10%. In other words, 90% of teenage boys in the country, ages 16 and 17, worked. And he said, uh, due to raising minimum wages and due to fatherlessness and all sorts of social programs and just government interference,
Sure.
um, we've got such a huge unemployment rate amongst teenage males in particular. And as Thomas Sowell says, he says it doesn't do any community any good to have a bunch of teenage males hanging out on the street corners without a job. And so, what
All
I
right.
see, yeah, he's always spot on. Um, but I think the biggest problems is that you've got single parent homes, you've got no supervision. Kids come home from school, there's nobody there. They're out running the streets. They're not working. They're not being raised with a certain measure of discipline, and so that becomes this exponential problem decade after decade that just keeps growing. We're seeing more of that happen. We're not seeing more teenagers going to work. In fact, as we continue to raise the unemployment or the minimum wage rate in this country, that's destroying low income jobs. It's reducing the amount of employment opportunities. Whereas you and I, we probably worked when we were teenagers. I know I did. I worked at 15 at Chuck E. Cheese.
I did too. Not Chuck E. Cheese, but I had to work. Had no
Exactly.
money.
And you know what? You learned how to budget money. You learned
Yeah.
the value of budgeting school and going to work on evenings and weekends. You were able to purchase your first automobile probably as a young man. And
Hmm.
those opportunities are being taken away. And so you don't have the problem with teenagers is, um, they're not being reined in. They're dropping out of school. The parents can't, um, are too busy because it's just usually one mom, and she's got to work two or three jobs. And society has just, it comes down to this: the breakdown of the family unit. The breakdown of the family unit. I keep beating that drum because
Hmm.
it's at the heart of the issue. The problem with teenagers isn't that teenagers have changed. Teenagers have been the same since Socrates talks about teenagers. You know,
Mm.
the family unit has changed and society has welcomed that. And we keep thinking that we're doing people a favor by creating the culture that we think is going to cause us to thrive. And the more society interferes and gets in the way, just the worse it is. So I don't necessarily blame the teenagers. Teenagers are, well, I'll tell you this, and then I'll wrap up this point. I think this is fascinating. Uh,
Okay.
I was at a barber getting a haircut about 10 years ago, and I was a youth pastor at the time,
Mhm.
working with teenagers. And he said, what do you do for a living? We're just making small talk. And I said, well, I'm a youth pastor. I work with the youth, with teens. And he's grumbling under his breath. He's oh, these teenagers today, they've got no respect for authority. You look at the schools are, just disrespect and violence, and they're perverts. They got pornography, and they're always looking at this, that, and the other. And
Right.
he was just talking about teenage culture. And I said this to him. I said, you know what? I said, it was an older generation that started to divorce at a 60% divorce rate in our country, leaving the teenagers fatherless and with a broken family unit. I said it was an older generation that took prayer out of schools, leaving
Mm.
the public school system to be a place of utter chaos. I said it was an older generation that started to mass produce pornography and put it into the hands of our kids. So I said, you're blaming the kids. They're just dealing with the hand that they were dealt. We've got to look at ourselves and say, we have served our kids this crappy, tumultuous culture, and then we're blaming
Hmm.
them for being disrespectful perverts. It's our problem as adults in society. So the kids are suffering the effects of what our generation and a generation above us has created.
Man, this is powerful. I am learning a lot about the prison ministry. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to Pastor Darren Schock. So let me just ask you this, right? We hear about in policing the blue wall of silence. And for some of my listeners who may not be familiar with what that is basically a wall where police officers stick up for each other and refuse to report ethical violations. But Pastor Shock, if you were to ever experience, and I'm not asking you to go into too much detail or mention names, we're going to keep that as it is. Just generally speaking, would you be the first person to call it out? What's wrong is wrong.
Well, we have to do that, as a
Mm.
Christian in good standing and trying to live a life of a good conscience before the Lord and before each other. You know, because we blur what is morally right and good, we are an immoral society. Because we can't call sin sin, because we define everything. Killing our kids is now called, it used to be called abortion. It's now called reproductive rights. We keep softening what it is so that we can keep doing it.
Mhm.
We take any moral standard and we continue to redefine it until it is comfortable for us. And then the lines are blurred. Where the church has failed is that the church is doing these things. The church is now embracing things like homosexuality and abortion.
That was
And
actually going to be my next question. And I think you've mentioned it earlier in the podcast that you still would even minister to people who may be transgender or homosexual, not necessarily of the Christian faith only.
yeah, well, I mean, the prison system has certainly seen a rise in the transgender LGBTQ population. We have 250-pound burly bearded grown men living in female cells
Mm.
at the York County Prison and in prisons and jails all over the country. It's not unique to our community. It's what's happening because the federal government says it has to happen. So we've blurred. We don't even know what a woman is. We don't even know what a man is. We don't even know what a gender means because we don't want to know, because it makes us feel better to be passive as a society. And now we are seeing the ridiculous. 20 years ago, I don't care how liberal you were, you would have laughed the idea out of the room that a man could become a
Right.
woman. you would have laughed these things out of the room. But nowadays we are celebrating. The Bible says that when the man of lawlessness, who's the Antichrist, comes, what will be seen as unrighteousness will be celebrated, and what will be practiced. So what is evil will be spoken of as good, and what is good will be spoken of as evil.
Right.
And we are seeing that today. The marriage family unit that God created as good is being looked at as patriarchal tyranny. And we can't have men leading in the homes. We can't have a man be the marriage of a man and a woman is seen as suppressive to the LGBTQ
Mm.
community. And so the church is, unfortunately, in an attempt to be liked, is just smiling and nodding and accepting anything, and it's weakened the ministry of the church. It's weakened our society. And yeah, we do minister. We minister to transgenders, and we've been able to see some of them make professions of faith and have renounced their false identities. But we minister to them just the same. I mean, again, I don't care what your criminal or sexual orientation is. Sexual immorality is sexual
It's about
immorality.
where you're going in the end, right? Trusting in Christ.
Exactly, exactly.
So I can only imagine, and thank you for bringing the social and the morality side of being a chaplain into the conversation. So we think about prison and the different custody levels, right? Whether it be maximum security or minimum security. Uh, how important is the power of your words as a prison chaplain? We call it in policing verbal judo. It's a de escalation tactic. I'm pretty sure perhaps in the prison environment, I don't know if you were trained on that, but how is it important to not make someone aggressive, to bring them down?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people do come into the chaplain's office aggressive
Mm,
sometimes. Our most aggressive population has historically tended to be our Muslim population. For whatever reason, that's just the pattern that I
okay.
observe. And so I will, throughout the year, get some aggressive Muslim man who is upset because he couldn't practice his Juma Friday prayer with all of the other Muslim inmates in the facility, as is the custom in
Wow.
Islam. All the men in the community are supposed to gather together for Juma prayer, and why can't I meet with a guy on North Block even though I'm in South Block?
Mm,
And for whatever the reason, I'll get some aggressive, hostile people. Or if they get denied a religious accommodation. I mean, I've had inmates ask me for knives in order to celebrate a certain ritual that they want to
now
do.
that's not allowed.
And exactly. That's not so. So when an inmate gets denied something, why can't I meet with my buddies? Why can't I have this or have that? They'll sometimes come in and they'll be upset and they'll cuss me
Mm,
out. And I'll say to them, I'll say, hey, let's please have a seat on the couch. And I'll say, what do you and I have in common? Let's talk about what we've got in common, because they'll know I'm a Christian, and it doesn't, they know that, and that's fine. But I'll say, let's talk about what we have in
mhm.
common. And they'll talk about the fact that we both worship, we have a monotheistic faith. We both say that we worship the God of Abraham. We talk about the commonalities. And then once we establish a certain common ground, that tends to be fairly de-escalating. And then I can sit and say, now what is it that I can help you with? We're both men that are wanting to seek truth and are wanting to worship as freely as we can. So how can I help you establish that? How can I help you do that? I'll tell you one quick
Yeah.
story. I had a guy who asked me for, actually, he had sent out and he had ordered two books that came in the mail on Luciferianism. Now,
Luciferianism. You have to break that one down. I have never heard of
yeah,
it before.
you can imagine with the name Lucifer in there that this is a satanic
Mm,
faith belief. And so one of my jobs as a chaplain is when the prison gets certain books of a religious nature, and it looks like they could be dangerous, or they, like for example, inmates are not allowed to do things like spell casting, or inmates are not allowed to read the Satanic Bible because the Satanic Bible teaches that you can exact revenge on your enemies. And in
So
other
that's like
words,
considered contraband if you would have a Satanic Bible in the prison.
right. So the rule of thumb, at least in our facility, is if there is a religious practice that if you do it, it violates safety and security protocols, then you cannot practice that religious practice. So, so when the Satanic Bible teaches certain things like do as thou wilt and exact revenge on your enemies, they say, if you do that, we're all in danger. So you can't have that book. Well, anyway, so fast forward, this guy gets this two books on Luciferianism, and the mailroom captain says, Darren, can you come and take a look at these? So I'm looking through it, just seeing if there's any red flags that might present a safety and security problem. Well, I get to a page that says, hey, here's the, I don't remember, the 12, 15, 20 principles of Luciferianism. One of them I remember said, seek to destroy anyone who might take away your freedom.
Freaking crazy.
Well, how does that play out in a jail setting? So I highlighted about a half dozen red flags, and I gave it to the mailroom captain, and I said, here's my recommendation. I wouldn't recommend the book based on these red flags, major security issues. Sure. So the inmate was denied those books. I think they were put in his property, and he can get them when he's released. Well, a day or so later, I'm walking through the halls. This inmate crouches down and he starts cussing me out through the little wicket slot where they pass the food trays into the inmates' cells. He's cussing me out. He says, you're the chaplain. I know who you are. You denied my books. I said, hey, look, buddy, I didn't deny your books. The mailroom captain denied them. But I said, I'm willing and more than happy to discuss why they were denied, but I'm not going to have it out with you in the hallway here. So I said, I will go back to my office. I will write you an explanation of why they were flagged. And then if you want to talk more, we can talk more. I went back to my office. I wrote him the 5 or 6 things that I saw that were flags. I sent it to him and I said, if you want to discuss more, please let me know. A day or two later, I get a slip that says, yeah, I want to discuss this with you. So I called the inmate up to my office. And I'm sitting there going, okay, Lord, I don't know if this guy's going to jump. I don't know what's going to happen, but just let this be an opportunity to glorify you and usher this guy into a relationship with you. Well, in comes the inmate. Now this guy's tatted up. He's got tattoos on his face, his neck. He's a rough looking guy. He's a guy that most people in society would walk on the other side of the street if they saw him coming. And so he sits down on my couch and I'm not sure what to expect. And he speaks first. He says, you know what, Chaplain, I owe you an apology. And at first I'm relieved, of course. And I say, well, what do you mean? What are you apologizing for? And he says, well, I read the list of the things that the Luciferianism religion teaches in their principles. And he said, I don't want to become any of those things. Wow. And I said, well, I looked into this guy. I'm able to go into his records and I could see his charges, but I don't look at his charges, but I can look at how he identifies with his faith. Every time he comes to the York County Prison, he is identified as a Christian. And I said to him, why is a guy who identifies as a Christian buying Luciferian books? And he says, you know what? I was so hurt by the church. I was so burnt by the church that I said, I don't ever want to have anything to do with those Christians again. Wow. And I said, man, you know what? I know what it's like to be burnt by the church. I'm so sorry that you had that experience. But I said, fortunately, we're not called to put our faith in the church. We're called to put our faith in Jesus Christ, who is not going to burn you, who is not going to reject you, who is not going to judge you on appearance or whatever. And we spent about the next 2 hours talking about the realities of Christianity and the faith and trust that we can put in Christ. And we spent a couple of weeks doing some Bible studies. When he got out, I met with him and took him to breakfast. And, I'm trying to walk alongside this guy because he was reaching out for Satanism just to escape the cruelty that he had experienced in some messed up Christian circle somewhere. And so when Christian, you know, when Christians get it wrong, it has a toll on society. And as a Christian man, and as a Christian husband and father, and as a Christian, minister, I want to get it right. I don't want to be the one who's responsible for becoming the stumbling block to somebody else.
Man, Darren, talk about putting faith into practice. You are obviously, my friend, a living example of that. I teach criminal justice, and the consensus that I get from the majority of students, especially, they always want to go into the world of policing, right? It's very few who actually say, I aspire to be a prison chaplain or a correctionals officer. And it always perplexes me of the reasons of why. So can you maybe just briefly explain to those who may be pursuing a career or desire to serve in the world of criminal justice in the public profession, why be a prison chaplain? It's not an
Yeah.
idea or a concept that's tossed around too much.
Yeah, I didn't even know a prison chaplain before I became one, and I certainly wasn't aspiring to be one. It just never, who's a prison chaplain,
Mhm.
right? I did want to be a cop when I was in junior high. I thought, man, those guys are cool. I want to be a cop. I think every boy has a fantasy of being a cowboy, a fireman, a cop, an astronaut, a something. And the cop thing just stuck with me. But prison chaplaincy, once I explored it, and I was called by a friend and said, hey, the chaplain at the York County Prison is going to be retiring. What's your interest level in maybe pursuing that? I said, well, let's talk about it.
Right.
So I think when you just get to a place where you say, Lord, I'm available to be used by you, he's going to introduce you to things that you really never considered. I think people are fearful that if they surrender to the Lord, he's going to send them off to Djibouti somewhere to be a missionary living in the stick, and so they don't want to do that. They want to stay in a comfortable environment. And so the Lord isn't about, he may need some people to go to Djibouti, but the point is that when you just get to a place where you say, Lord, I'm available to be used by you. What do you direct my steps? Something like a prison chaplaincy comes up, because, not to your point, nobody's really considering that as a vocation.
Yeah, they don't really consider that. And I don't necessarily hear it from those who are going into the ministry. It's always, I want to pastor a church or a local congregation where it's necessarily nice and cozy and safe. And that's not to take away at all from those inspiring to be local pastors, because we do need our shepherds right here domestically. But when we talk about the prison chaplaincy, I just don't hear it.
Yeah, we are trying to, as Good News Jail and Prison Ministry, as an organization, we're trying to, we've hired some positions over the years where their function is to be recruiting, to go to seminaries and Christian colleges and things, and to talk to students about considering chaplaincy, because the need is there. My goodness, the need is there.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions of incarcerated people in our country, and there are hundreds of millions incarcerated around the world. And it's a mission field that, as some people put it, it's like shooting fish in a barrel, so to speak, because the ministry is right there in front of you. You don't have to go walking the streets to find somebody to minister to. You just go behind bars, and there is a ripe field of people that are desperate, that are broken, that are frustrated, that are experimenting with faiths. Guys come into the jail system and they just start grasping. If their celly's a Mormon, well, then get me the Book of Mormon. I like what he's selling. If their celly's a Muslim, well, then yeah, I want a prayer rug and a kufi as well. They're just groping for something that they can bring peace and bring stability into their life. And so it is a ripe ministry field. And I think we are trying to do a better job of talking about the need. The Bible, half the doggone people in the Bible spent time in the pokey. I mean, they
There you
half the
go.
people read,
This is true.
it's like, and yet where's the prison ministry? It wasn't on my mind. So, and shame on me. I guess we need to do a better job of just looking at the realities of the prison incarceration population and saying, hey, what are we doing locally? We like to send people overseas, and that's great. We need to do that, but then we also can say as a church, hey, there are ministries in our backyard that we need to get behind and push, and prison ministry is one of those.
Yeah, thanks, Darren, for breaking that all down for my listeners, and I appreciate that. I think I've learned a lot in this segment. I have three really quick questions, and it's just really mind-boggling to me. So when you have inmates who are sitting there or perhaps before they're finally sentenced, do you ever get called to become a character witness on the behalf,
Yeah.
of the person who may be facing life in prison? Uh, if so, what do you
Yeah.
say? How do you face the
Yeah.
victims'
So
families?
one of the things that we are trained before, Good News does a good job of training us. We are trained to not ever take the role of a character advocate for an
Okay.
inmate. And there have been chaplains that have ended their careers by basically committing career suicide by deciding to go sit in a courtroom and speak to the character of an inmate, which there's nothing that puts a wedge between you and the law enforcement community and the administration of your jail or prison than deciding to become a legal advocate for the freedom of an inmate. That's not our job, and it shouldn't be our job. So when inmates say, hey, can you write a letter of recommendation, speaking to the fact that I've been in counseling with you for the last 6 months, or I've been attending Bible study, I say, you know what, that's not my place. If you want to write your judge and you can say, here's all the things I've learned in Bible study and write those things out, you give that to the judge. Teach him what you've learned, but don't ask me to come and be a character reference, because I can't and I won't, and I shouldn't.
No, I appreciate that for clarifying that point. So, have you seen that the community corrections programs, especially perhaps some of the ministry elements coming from Good News Jail and Prison Ministry, that in combination with the public service programs such as intense supervised probation, treatment facilities, work release programs, are all of these things actually working? Because, as taxpayers, we're putting our money into the system. So I think from your perspective, it would be nice to hear, are these things actually working?
Yeah, so the York County created what's called the York County Reentry Coalition, and they modeled that off of Lancaster County's Reentry Coalition program, which has had some success to a certain degree. And in short, what it is it's the community resources that have decided to come together and create a pathway for reentrants to successfully navigate coming back into society. It helps with providing transportation. It helps with providing job resources and medical needs and housing. In other words, it deals with the felt needs: housing, medical, job, transportation.
Okay.
What it doesn't deal with is the non-felt needs: friendships, belief systems, church community, the things that really make a person change the course of their trajectory are the non-felt needs being addressed. And so I've sat in on a lot of these reentry coalition meetings, and it's not that it's a bad thing, and it's not that the community having programs is a bad thing, but it's the world's answer to dealing with sin. let's offer a program, let's give them a handout, let's give them a leg up. And sometimes those things are needed. It's not that that's bad. We see help and charity and resources in the Bible for people in need. But if you're not addressing the non-felt needs, that's where transformation changes. What a person believes, a person's friendship circle, a person who has a vision beyond themselves and a vision of purpose that goes beyond their felt needs. When a person starts to have different values, then their life changes. And so, to wrap up this point, there's a ministry out there called Onesimus. It's put on by World Impact. I should say they started this ministry. You can go online on worldimpact.org or .com or something and find the Onesimus Project. Basically, what it is it's a ministry that teaches churches how to assimilate reentrants in a way that addresses the non-felt needs, because the county is going to address the felt needs, but who's addressing the non-felt needs? That's where the church needs to come into play. And they talk about how to do that in a way that's successful, that's not enabling the reentrant, that's not pacifying, that's not taking the wrong approach. But it talks about how to have healthy boundaries and how to help reentrants assimilate back into society and into the local church. So good news, I think, is trying to educate churches. I've gone and spoken at churches about these types of programs. Here's the biggest obstacle, though, that I've faced is that it's a big ask. When you go to a church and you say, this is the kind of resources and manpower that's needed to become a reentrant destination, so to speak, a lot of churches feel overwhelmed by that.
Sure.
And they Absolutely. Just, part of it is the stigma of we're trying to protect our flock from these kinds of people. And others just simply say, hey, our door's open to everybody. Anybody can come to our church. Well, that's fine, but that's not enough either. There needs to be an intentional plan that addresses the non-felt needs. And so far, the community has not done a great job. I have not found any churches in York, and I've talked with about 15 or 20 of them. And so far, none of them have really said, yeah, we're going to embrace a program like Onesimus. And so I don't sit in judgment of that because I don't know, until I went through the Onesimus training, I had no idea what to do either. So I'm at the very cusp of learning myself, but it's a need that needs to be addressed. And social programs have a very, very limited success rate because they only address the felt needs, not the unfelt needs.
No, thank you for saying that, and I appreciate you sharing for my listeners. So I have a final question. Are you ready for this? It's $1 million question. You know it was coming from the very words of a person of the cloth. Where do you stand on capital punishment? And do you feel it's antithetical to your Christian faith?
Well, I am for capital punishment. I think one of the there's several lessons that we read in the scriptures that justice needs to be exact. It needs to be swift. It needs to be fitting of the crime. And we certainly don't have that in society today. There's no deterrent today. There's very little deterrent. The criminal
because those who would actually, and I'm sorry to cut you off, I just want to interject this. Yeah. The opposing argument would say that capital punishment does not deter crime. So let's get rid of it, abolish it altogether. Continue on.
I mean, well, what does deter crime? Look, I'm not going to say if you impose a death sentence, then people are going to just simply go, whoa, okay, I guess I'm not going to kill my neighbor. I mean, people will murder because it's in our human nature to be evil. We know that laws don't prevent. I mean, there's 1,000,001 gun laws, and it's certainly not keeping people from shooting each other. Laws don't prevent criminal activity, but they tell us how to address criminal activity when it happens. And so what I see day in and day out is a criminal justice system where a guy has been picked up on charge X, and he sits and he sits and he sits. And sometimes he gets a slap on the wrist, sometimes he gets served a few years, and he comes back, and the cycle just repeats itself. All I can say is what we're doing doesn't work. I'm not saying capital punishment is the solution that will do, XYZ, but I'm not morally opposed to it. I think when it's used effectively, I think it historically has worked. I don't see any reason to suggest otherwise. But to me, that's one of many examples of a slow, ineffectual, untimely punishment doesn't fit the punishment doesn't fit the crime, of which capital punishment is one of a million examples I'm sure we could talk about. Just repeat offense, repeat offense, repeat offense. And so we've got a moral problem in our country. These are symptoms of it. But yeah, I'm definitely pro capital punishment when appropriate. I like what guys like Ben Shapiro say, rapists should be killed or castrated. And I think there's a various degree of crimes where you can say, yeah, that's deserving of death. That's deserving of never being free again. That's deserving of castration or this, that, and the other. I think, yeah, I'm all for that.
No, I appreciate you being honest about that. And I share similar views in terms of capital punishment. I'm all for it, right? But the show's not really about me. We can go on for hours just to talk about that topic alone. But there you have it, folks. Thank you, Pastor Shock, for appearing on the show. You are a warrior of the faith. And for that reason, my brother, I really commend you. Thank you for sharing about the good news in jail and prison ministry. I am sure many lives are being changed for the better. To my podcast crew, follow me by hashtagging me Dr. J Talks. And don't forget to check out my brand new website and YouTube page. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel to hear more exciting episodes. Support the show by sending me a Cash App found on my website at www.drjtalks.com. And with that, we are going to rock out. Thank you, Pastor Shock. I appreciate you, and I love you, brother.
God bless. Love you, man. See you soon.
Peace.